hand over to George.
Thank you very much, and hi everybody. I'm glad to be here, and especially that impact is the subject of today's seminar. I've been talking about the seminar 2 days ago with Jonathan, and he told me about a colleague who remained unnamed. Like when he had 1.5 hours to give a presentation, he kind of screwed up quite badly and didn't even get beyond the introduction, and whereas at another occasion when he only had 10 to 15 minutes, he made it to the point. It was a very good presentation. So I hope you and I will experience the same effect. The more so as Jonathan's second remark was, if you talk for 15 minutes and don't get to the point, this might mean that you don't have a point, which I surely hope not. Okay, so as most of you who have read the abstract, which I hope, know that my subject is social impact, and more specifically, I'm interested in how to best measure the effects of charities, foundations, social enterprises, etc., working for the common good. And so if we think about the primary effects that these organizations usually have, it is social cohesion, political stability, so thinking about it at a very aggregate level, and similar aspects. So I'm trying to explore these final outcomes and how we get to them, how we can assess them in 4 steps. So I'm going to use physical impact as the metaphor and as a linking connection through all the steps that I'm actually making. And I'm using the metaphor of a billiards game to kind of connect physical impact with economic impact and then move to social impact to see what the problems are that arise when we think about social impact and what the deficits of existing approaches are in order to finally arrive at the response that I give, which is that focusing on capital forms is a way of dealing with the problems that we have with social impact. So the foundation is impact. Here you see a picture that I was already referring to. And if we think about a billiards game, you usually have a physical impact chain that if you want to trace it in an experimental design, you have an impulse, then you have a contact between the white ball and the others, which then gain momentum. They move and then there are certain trajectories, and finally they end up in certain positions. And if you have an experimental design, a physical experimental design, you have perfect information on pretty much everything. So you know the force and the direction of the break shot, you know the size and the weight and the exact placement of the billiard balls, as well as the cushions, and like that you can track the motions. So when we think about economic production at an aggregate level, we have a similar constellation of factors. So if you think about economic production, you have resources, which are the inputs into the whole impact chain, which are usually commodities if you think about industrial production. Then you have labor and capital, which usually comes in the form of production sites, machines, etc. And these are used to transform the inputs into outputs, which are marketable goods, which then contribute to an outcome, which is, in its main effect, a contribution to economic prosperity. So if we look at that, we have a similar level of perfect information on all the factors we need to assess what's happening there. So now what's the problem when we think about social impact? The problem is that confusion arises. And as you can see, the picture here is a bit more blurred. You don't see the 2 balls on the left and on the right-hand side. So they might be there, they might not be there. They might be at a greater distance to the other balls. They might be greater or smaller as the others. And also you see that the playing field is not that, well, that precise anymore. So the cushions have disappeared and, well, you just have less information. And what is this caused by? So actually, in the first steps, you have a similar constellation of factors. You also have resources, which are usually not commodities, but ideas and concepts. You have labor and capital going in there. In terms of capital, we have a difference in the sense that it's not so much about production sites or machines, but about other capital factors, like social capital or political capital, but I'm going to get back to that because it's the central point of what I'm going to refer to later on. But the critical two aspects when we think about where's the confusion coming from is when we move from the transformation process to outputs and then from outputs to incomes. And the problem is that when you go from the transformation process to outputs, you just have a larger variety of outputs. These are events, interactions, systems, rather than discrete goods. So it might be a system of neighborhood help that these organizations are creating. It might be a platform for consumer protection or for environmentally sustainable consumption. It might also be actor networks that kind of try to enforce certain political positions. And these different systems feed to various degrees into the final outcome, some of which I've named earlier, but we have some more that come in here. And so you see that there's a problem both with the measurement of these very complex constructs as well as with the attribution within the impact process. So if we think about this metaphorically, it's that, as I said before, the size, weight, and exact placement of the billiard balls is not that clear anymore, as well as the distance and the padding of the cushions, and so we have a difficulty in tracing the motions, and so the causal connections just become less clear. So we've got two existing attempts of how to deal with this. So how do we assess these outcomes? So the first picture, I guess, is quite straightforward. It's a scale, so it's about the costs and benefits. So it refers to cost-benefit analysis. You might be more puzzled about the second one, as I have been as well. But this is, I think, the second hit I got when I was searching in a German PICS portal for satisfaction. So apparently Germans think that cows, or at least the landscape, gives you a very high degree of satisfaction. I don't know whether I would have had the same results in a UK picture database, but anyway. So we could also use this picture, I suppose, to refer to life satisfaction approaches. So what are the problems with the existing approaches? I think, especially because it's quite often used in a policy context in the UK, most of you know roughly what cost-benefit analysis is, and it is looking at the costs of an intervention and it's trying to assess the benefits that come from all the outcomes that we've been discussing earlier. And it does so by trying to monetize these outcomes, which is fair for certain organizations or interventions. Think, for example, of work integration, where the main benefit derives from the fact that you bring someone who's been out of the job market into the job market, who creates income for themselves and also saves the state money because the state doesn't have to pay any transfers anymore. But it's less fit or even unfit where the primary effects are very hard to monetize. So, for example, what's the monetary value of social relations or self-esteem? So, of course, cost-benefit analysis scholars have tried to find answers to that, but none of those seem to be very satisfying, and the fact that you often see in cost-benefit analyses in terms of social impact is that these aspects, although they might be central to the intervention, are being disregarded. So instead of ending up at the picture on the left, where you have a snapshot, but still a snapshot of all the balls that you actually want to see, you end up having an incomplete picture. So you lose information on several important components which might actually be central to the intervention. The other approach is life satisfaction. And life satisfaction, if you boil it down, is about the question, how satisfied are you with X, Y, Z, or with your life in total? So if you do that, it's quite a simple measure and it's easily applicable. But the problem, as you might have recognized already, is that this is being asked at a very aggregate level, which means that you lose a lot of sensitive information when you only look at satisfaction, because there's many other components that influence satisfaction, but that you're not assessing in the process. So this would be, if we think about evidence-based healthcare, we would have new blood pressure medication, and we would only ask the people whether their health satisfaction is satisfied or not, disregarding the actual effect on blood pressure. And so what you have here is quite different to what you have in cost-benefit analysis, because you're only taking the final positions of the balls into account, and from there you try to deduct what has happened, which is fine as long as the balls are not of different sizes. As you see here, the white, the red, the orange, and the other red ball are bigger than the others. And if you try to use that in order to deduct what has happened, this is going to have quite some other implications, as if you assume that all of the balls have been of equal size. So what I'm proposing in order to address the social impact problem is to circumvent the two steps where the confusion arises. So I propose you start earlier in the impact chain and you look at the capital forms that I've mentioned earlier. And the special thing about the population of organizations that I'm interested in is that they're not only using social capital, for example, social networks, social connections, or political capital, which might be political participation or the assertion of certain political positions, but that they are actively creating these sorts of capital. And by doing that, so by focusing on the sorts of capital, you are, metaphorically speaking again, and you see that in that picture, you're assessing the size, the weight, and the exact placement of the billiard balls, and also the energy at the initial contact, and then you go on from there, which is to say you use a proxy for social impact. And instead of starting with the final positions and trying to deduct what has happened, you start with where the movement starts, and then use that as a proxy for the effects that might follow. And if you try to trace all these effects, we've seen that you've run into problems that are probably going to be worse than the loss of information in terms of the approximate factor. And so the benefits are that this is more immediate, this is closer to organizational activities. It is at the same time more detailed, as for example, if you compare it to the life satisfaction approach. And it's also more embedded into a wider variety of social sciences. And now we finally arrive at my last slide, and I don't have the time to go into all the different sorts of capital or to show you how this would be done or how I am trying to do it empirically. But I think in order to do that, it's important to understand why I'm doing it in the first place. So this is why I chose this approach in order to present my research. So if you think about I'm going to use social capital as an example of how you could actually measure it. So you have several fields which are in a way unified by one criterion. It could be community building, it could be associational life, or even elderly housing models, which is actually the case that I'm using in the empirical investigation. But in order to explain that, I'll need too much time. Anyway, it's basically about the social capital they produce, all these organizations, or all these interventions, and the follow-up effects that result from them. And so if you can detect a change in social capital in these interventions, you've already shown part of the social impact chain, and that with a higher degree of validity and reliability than if you try to track the whole thing. And so what you could do, and what I am trying to do, is to use a survey and investigate the components that form part of social capital, which is social context. So I was referring to social networks. This might be the number, the frequency, and other aspects of social context. It might be, you should also look at the mutual support that there is, or the sense of belonging, trust, and the engagement for or within the community. And these are things that you can assess more objectively than if you just ask, has this increased your satisfaction or not? And at the same time, it's things that you can measure directly without trying to transfer them into monetary values. So this is basically the approach, and I hope I have not puzzled you all that much, and I'm looking forward to receiving your questions.